The day Georgia Harper walked into the Harlan County courthouse with a hand-drawn map tucked under one arm and a dead husband's name still fresh on the headstone outside of town, every man in that building either looked away or laughed, and not a single one of them expected her to win. It was the spring of 1884, deep in the heart of West Texas, where the sky stretched so wide and so blue that it made a person feel both enormous and completely insignificant at the same time. The land around Harlan County was not gentle. It was cut through with dry arroyos and limestone ridges, and the grass grew in patches the color of old straw, fighting for every drop of moisture the earth would give. Water was not just valuable here, water was everything. It was the difference between a living ranch and a graveyard of sun-bleached fence posts, and everyone in the county knew it. Georgia Harper knew it better than most. She was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of creek water after a good rain, somewhere between brown and green, shifting depending on the light and her mood. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself as though she were, with a straight back and a deliberate way of moving that made people pay attention, whether they wanted to or not. She had come to Texas 7 years ago as the young bride of Thomas Harper, a decent man with a dream of cattle ranching and a quarter section of land that straddled the Callow Creek just east of the county seat. Thomas had been dead for 11 months when Georgia walked into that courthouse. He had died of a fever in the summer of 1883, swift and merciless the way summer fevers were in West Texas, leaving Georgia with 2 children, 9-year-old Sam and 6-year-old Nora, a half-built barn, 40 head of cattle, and a creek that had been slowly, deliberately, and very illegally choked off upstream. The creek was the heart of it all. The Callow Creek ran north to south, cutting through the Harper Quarter section on its way down from the limestone hills before it eventually fed into the larger water table that served the whole eastern edge of the county. Thomas had filed water rights on that creek before any of the big operations had pushed east, back when the Harper land was the only claim touching the waterway. He had the paperwork. Georgia still had it, folded carefully in the cedar box Thomas had kept on his desk. The problem was the Darrow Ranch. The Darrow Ranch was the biggest operation in Harlan County by a considerable margin. Cornelius Darrow had built it over 20 years, buying up land with a mixture of shrewd dealing and outright bullying, until his operation ran to nearly 40,000 acres. He ran thousands of head of cattle and employed somewhere between 40 and 60 cowboys depending on the season, and he had purchased the land directly upstream from the Harper Quarter section 3 years ago. Within 6 months of that purchase, someone had begun diverting the Callow Creek's flow through a series of earthen dams and irrigation channels that fed Darrow's operation and sent only a trickle of muddy water down to Georgia's land. Thomas had written letters. He had visited the county seat. He had spoken to the land commissioner's office and been told, politely but firmly, that these things took time. Then Thomas had died, and the men who had been politely stalling him seemed to believe that the matter had resolved itself. Georgia did not agree. She had spent the better part of 11 months gathering documentation, speaking to the county surveyor, finding the original land grant paperwork, and consulting with a lawyer in Abilene who had, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to represent her. The lawyer's name was Whitfield, and he was a thin, nervous man who understood water law but was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of going up against Cornelius Darrow. He had agreed to file the claim if Georgia did the legwork, and Georgia had done exactly that. She filed on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Tuesday afternoon, word had spread to the Darrow Ranch. The ranch headquarters sat 12 miles northwest of town, a sprawling compound of white limestone buildings arranged around a central yard. There were bunkhouses for the hands, a forge, a cookhouse, a massive barn, and at the center of it all, Cornelius Darrow's house, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and glass windows that had been freighted in from San Antonio at considerable expense. Cornelius Darrow liked people to know what he had. He was 63 years old, thick-set and gray-haired, with hands like slabs of cured leather, and a voice that had never fully lost its Tennessee drawl. He had built everything he owned through iron will and a complete indifference to the comfort of anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. He was not a man who shouted or threatened. He was worse than that. He was a man who simply acted and expected the world to accommodate itself to his actions after the fact. When his foreman, a hard-eyed man named Burl Cates, rode out to tell him about the filing, Darrow was standing on his porch watching the sun go down over his western pastures. He listened to Burl's report without turning around, then he said, "Find out everything there is to know about that woman and come back to me in the morning." Burl Cates nodded and left, and Cornelius Darrow went inside and poured himself a glass of bourbon and did not appear to worry about it. But that evening, in the bunkhouse nearest the main yard, a man named Edgar Maddox sat on the edge of his bunk and listened to the other cowboys talk about what Darrow had said, and something settled in his chest that he had been trying to ignore for a long time. Edgar Maddox was 28 years old, and he had been riding for the Darrow Ranch for 4 years. He was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself. He was broad through the shoulders with hands that knew rope and fence wire and the weight of a saddle, and he had a face that was weathered beyond his years, the kind of face that the Texas sun made out of men who worked in it all day, every day. He had dark brown hair and gray eyes that were often described by people who didn't know him well as cold, and by people who did know him as simply careful. He had grown up in the hill country south of Austin, the son of a small-time cattle man who had lost his land to a larger neighbor through a combination of bad seasons and bad luck. Edgar had watched his father fight that losing battle for years, had watched the land go piece by piece, had watched his father try every legal avenue available to him and fail, not because the law was against him, but because the man who was taking the land had enough money to make the law move slowly and carefully until men like Edgar's father simply ran out of the resources to keep fighting. He had left home at 19 and worked for a succession of ranches, drifting north and west, until he had ended up at the Darrow operation, which paid well and didn't ask too many questions. He had told himself that a job was a job, that he was not responsible for how Darrow had assembled his empire, that a man had to work somewhere. He had done his work well, kept his head down, and pushed the uneasy feeling aside whenever it rose up. But now it was rising up and refusing to be pushed. He heard Burl Cates telling the other men that Mrs. Harper's claim was nothing, that Darrow's lawyers would bury it inside of a month, that a widow woman with a 2-bit cattle operation wasn't going to cause Cornelius Darrow a moment of real trouble. He heard the laughter that followed. He heard someone say that maybe someone ought to go out to the Harper place and explain to the widow how things worked in Harlan County. That was the thing that made the decision for him. The next morning, Edgar Maddox asked Burl Cates for the day to ride to town for supplies. Burl gave it to him without much thought, because Edgar was reliable and didn't abuse the privilege, and because Burl was too busy organizing Darrow's response to the legal filing to pay close attention to his quiet cowboys. Edgar rode to town, but he did not go to the general store first. He went to the courthouse. Georgia Harper was there when he arrived, sitting in the outer office of the county clerk with a folder of documents in her lap, and a look on her face that was equal parts determination and exhaustion. She looked up when he came through the door, and she saw immediately by the cut of his clothes and the brand on his saddle horse through the window that he was a Darrow man, and her eyes went carefully neutral in the way of someone who had learned not to show alarm. Edgar took off his hat when he came inside, which made the clerk look up from his ledger in mild surprise, because cowboys did not always remember to do that. "Mrs. Harper," Edgar said, and his voice was quiet but clear. She looked at him steadily. "You have the advantage of me," she said. "Edgar Maddox, I ride for the Darrow Ranch." He said it plainly, not trying to soften it or obscure it. "I wanted to come and tell you something." She waited. "I know the north stretch of Callow Creek," he said. "I've ridden it since I came to work at the Darrow operation 4 years ago. I know where those diversion channels were put in, and I know when they were put in, and I know they went in after your husband filed his original water rights claim. What I mean to say is, what you're claiming is true. The diversion is real and it is deliberate, and I can say so." The clerk had put down his pen. Georgia Harper was looking at Edgar Maddox with an expression that had shifted from neutral wariness into something more complex, something that was measuring him very carefully. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You work for Cornelius Darrow." "I do," Edgar said, "and I'm standing here anyway." There was a long pause in which the only sound was the wind pushing grit against the courthouse windows. "My lawyer is a man named Whitfield," Georgia said at last, "out of Abilene. He's been corresponding with the county land commissioner's office. If you're willing to make a statement, he'd need to hear it from you directly." "I understand that." "And you understand what it would mean for your employment at the Darrow Ranch?" He looked at her with those careful gray eyes. "I do," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she gave a small, precise nod, as though she had come to a decision about him. "Then I am grateful for it, Mr. Maddox." He put his hat back on and left, and Georgia Harper watched him go through the dusty courthouse window, and she tried very hard not to read too much into what had just happened. But she thought about it. She thought about it on the ride home, 12 miles east on the county road, with the afternoon sun cutting across the dry hills and the wind picking up the way it always did in late afternoon in West Texas. She thought about the steadiness of his voice and the directness of his eyes, and the fact that a man employed by Cornelius Darrow had walked into the courthouse and said the words she had been struggling to get anyone to say for nearly a year. She got home as the light was going golden, and her son Sam came running out from the barn. He had been feeding the cattle, and Nora appeared on the porch with flour on her hands because she had been helping with the biscuits, and Georgia looked at her children and her little house with its 2 rooms and its struggling kitchen garden, and she thought, "This is worth fighting for, whatever it takes." She wrote a letter to Whitfield in Abilene that evening, explaining that she had found a witness, and she described Edgar Maddox as briefly and accurately as she could. She sent Sam with it to town the next morning. 3 days later, Edgar Maddox arrived at the Darrow Ranch headquarters at the end of a long day of fence riding, to find that his saddle and his bedroll and his personal kit had been placed outside the bunkhouse door. Burl Cates was leaning against the wall of the bunkhouse with his arms crossed, and he told Edgar without any preamble that Darrow knew he had been to the courthouse, and that his services were no longer required. Edgar looked at his gear and then at Burl Cates and didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll need my last 2 weeks' wages," he said. Burl reached into his vest pocket and held out an envelope. "Darrow's a fair man," Burl said, which they both knew was not entirely accurate but was the kind of thing you said in these circumstances. Edgar took the envelope and loaded his gear on his horse and rode out of the Darrow Ranch in the blue-gray dusk of early spring, and what he felt, surprising himself considerably, was something very close to relief. He could not go back to Harlan. He had very little money and no employment, and the Darrow influence in this county was wide enough that finding work locally was going to be a challenge. He thought about riding on heading west to New Mexico territory, maybe finding work in one of the ranches that hadn't been swallowed by someone like Darrow yet. He thought about it seriously for about 3 miles, and then he turned east instead of west, following the county road in the direction of the Harper place. He told himself he was simply going to let her know what had happened, so that she and her lawyer could make plans accordingly. He told himself it was a practical matter. He arrived at the Harper place as a thin line of orange was still visible along the western horizon. The house was small and well kept, set back from the road with a kitchen garden along the south side and a modest barn behind it. There was a light in the window and smoke from the chimney, and the sound of cattle in the pasture beyond the barn. The Callow Creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, or rather, the dry channel where the creek had once run freely now showed only a shallow thread of muddy water that was barely enough to sustain the cattle. Georgia Harper came to the door before he could knock, because she had heard his horse. She was in a plain calico dress without her hat, her hair partially undone from its daytime arrangement, and for a moment when she opened the door she looked so purely herself, so unguarded and direct, that Edgar had to look away briefly at the night sky. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "you've been let go." It wasn't a question, she had half expected it. "This afternoon," he said, "I wanted to tell you in person." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. He left his hat on the peg by the door, the way a man does when he's been raised to show respect, and followed her into the main room where Sam was sitting at the table with a school book, and Nora was already asleep on her cot in the corner. The room was warm from the cook stove and smelled of cornbread and coffee. Georgia poured him a cup of coffee without asking whether he wanted one, and set it on the table, and then she sat down across from him with her own cup and looked at him carefully. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. He told her plainly the gear outside the bunkhouse, the wages, Burl Cates, and the message from Darrow. She listened without interrupting. "I've written to Whitfield," she said when he finished. "He'll want your statement as soon as possible before Darrow has time to take legal steps to complicate things." "I can ride to Abilene," Edgar said. "I was planning to go myself. The children can stay with my neighbor, Mrs. Alderman. I need to consult with Whitfield directly about the next steps." "Then I'll ride with you," Edgar said, and it came out more naturally than he expected, as though it were simply obvious. "If you'll have me." Georgia looked at him for a moment that was a little longer than strictly necessary, and then she said, "We'd leave at first light." "I'll camp on your property tonight if that's agreeable to you," Edgar said. "There's good grazing for my horse along your east pasture." She nodded, and he thanked her for the coffee and went back out into the dark. Sam, who had been doing his schoolwork with one ear on the adult conversation, looked up at his mother when Edgar was gone. "Is he going to help us?" Sam asked. Georgia looked at the closed door. "It appears so," she said. The ride to Abilene took most of 2 days, with an overnight camp on the open plain, east of the county line. Georgia rode a dun mare that had been Thomas's, a solid and dependable animal, and Edgar rode his own bay gelding, and they rode side by side on the long flat stretches of road and talked, or didn't talk, in the particular easy rhythm that develops between people who are comfortable with silence. He learned in those 2 days that she had grown up in Georgia, which was where her given name came from, her father being a sentimental man, and that she had met Thomas Harper in Atlanta when she was 23 and he was 29, and that they had come west 3 years later in 1877. He learned that she had grown the kitchen garden from seed and had read enough about soil and water management to know more about irrigation than most people gave her credit for. He learned that she had been corresponding with the Land Commissioner's office for nearly 8 months before Thomas died, and had continued the correspondence afterward, and had kept every letter received and sent, catalogued and dated. She was methodical in a way that impressed him, and also made him feel slightly ashamed of how little he had done about his own situation over the past 4 years. He told her about his father's land. He didn't plan to, it wasn't the kind of thing he usually talked about, but she had a way of asking questions that were quiet and genuine, and that seemed to assume he would be honest in his answers, and so he was. "How old were you when they lost it?" she asked. 16 when it started in earnest," he said. 19 when my father signed the last deed of sale. He died 4 years later. My mother went to live with her sister in San Marcos." "I'm sorry," Georgia said, and she said it the way people who had actually lost something said it, without any of the cushioned performance of people who hadn't. "It was a long time ago," he said. She looked at the horizon. "Does it get easier?" "The losing part or the being angry about it?" She glanced at him, and something in her face shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "Both, I suppose." He thought about it honestly. "The losing part gets easier," he said. The anger stays a while, but it turns into something else eventually, turns into something you can use. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I hope you're right. They reached Abilene in the early afternoon of the second day, and met with Whitfield at his office on Chestnut Street. Whitfield was exactly as Georgia had described him, thin and nervous, with ink-stained fingers and a habit of cleaning his spectacles when he was thinking. He was clearly made anxious by Edgar's presence, not because he doubted Edgar's credibility, but because he understood what it meant to have a Darrow employee testify against the ranch. The value of your testimony, Whitfield said carefully, looking over his spectacles at Edgar, depends on its specificity. We need dates, measurements, descriptions of what exactly was built on the north stretch of the creek and when. Can you provide that? I can, Edgar said. I helped dig one of those channels. Whitfield went very still. I beg your pardon. In the fall of 1881, I was part of the crew that built the secondary diversion channel on the North Pasture. Burl Cates told us it was to improve the irrigation for the winter wheat. We weren't told about any existing water rights. Georgia was looking at him. He had not mentioned this before. I found out about the Harper claim afterward, Edgar said, looking at her directly. About 6 months later, when your husband came to the ranch to speak with Darrow. I was in the yard when Darrow sent him away. I didn't know then what I know now about what that meant for your operation, but I remember the date and the conversation. Whitfield was already writing. This is very significant, he said, more to his notepad than to either of them. Georgia said quietly, you helped build the channel that cut off our water. I did, Edgar said. I didn't know it was illegal. That doesn't change the fact. The room was quiet except for Whitfield's pen scratching. Thank you for telling me, Georgia said. Her voice was even, but her hands, folded on the table in front of her, had tightened slightly. After the meeting, they walked out onto Chestnut Street in the afternoon sun and stood for a moment on the boardwalk outside Whitfield's office. The street was busy freight wagons, a string of horses being led by a rancher's hand, a couple of women in their afternoon dresses making their careful way around a muddy patch near the apothecary. I should have told you when I came to the courthouse, Edgar said. Yes, she said, you should have. I told you now. You did. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. I need to think about whether that changes anything about the case. It doesn't, he said. Whitfield is right that it's significant. My involvement in building the channel actually makes me a better witness to its construction and purpose. That's not what I meant, she said. He understood then that she was not talking about the case. He looked at the side of her face, the clean line of her jaw, the way she was holding herself very straight, and he said, I understand. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were very clear. I appreciate what you are doing, Mr. Maddox, I genuinely do, but I need to know that you are doing it for the right reasons. I am, he said. Though I couldn't have told you exactly what those reasons were 3 weeks ago, I can tell you now. What are they? Because it is right, he said simply. And because my father lost his land the same way your husband lost his water, and nobody stepped out and said anything then, and I have spent a long time knowing that and not doing anything about it. She held his gaze for a long moment, and the afternoon sun caught the green in her eyes, and then she looked away again. All right, she said. Then let's get on. They stayed overnight in Abilene, Georgia at a boarding house near the courthouse district, Edgar at a cheaper establishment on the east side of town, and rode back the next morning. The ride back was different from the ride out. The conversation was a little deeper and a little less careful, and twice she laughed not politely but genuinely, at something he said about the time he had tried to break a mule that turned out to be fundamentally unbreakable, and the laugh was low and clear, and made the wide Texas sky feel suddenly smaller and warmer. By the time they reached the county line, Edgar had decided 2 things. 1. He was not going to New Mexico territory. 2. He was in serious danger of falling in love with Georgia Harper, which was possibly the worst timing in the history of bad timing, given that the woman was in the middle of a legal battle and grieving her husband and needed an ally, not a man with complicated feelings standing at her kitchen table. He resolved to be useful and patient, and to keep his feelings neatly to one side where they would not interfere with anything important. This resolution lasted about as long as his resolutions generally lasted, which was to say it lasted until she needed something, at which point it dissolved entirely. The first test came 3 days after their return, when 2 of Darrow's cowboys appeared at the edge of the Harper property on horseback and spent an hour riding the fence line with pointed slowness, not doing anything overtly threatening, but making sure Georgia could see them from her porch. Sam saw them first and came to get his mother, and Edgar, who had been mending a section of fence on the western boundary with Georgia's permission and in exchange for a meal, came around the corner of the barn and saw them too. He went to his horse without a word, and Georgia said, "Don't." He stopped. "It's what they want," she said. "Any kind of confrontation gives Darrow something to work with." "We're not going to give it to him." She was right. He stood beside his horse and watched the 2 riders complete their leisurely circuit of the fence line and ride back north, and he didn't say anything. "You can be angry," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Just not here." "I'm not angry," he said, which was not entirely true. She looked at the retreating horses. "I am," she said quietly. "I'm angry every single day. I just don't let it run the show." After that, he came to the Harper place most mornings. He had taken a room at the Alderman place. Mrs. Alderman was a widow herself, a practical-minded woman in her 60s who rented 2 rooms to travelers and thought Georgia Harper was the most sensible woman in the county, and he earned his keep there by doing repairs and heavy work. But the mornings he spent at Georgia's place, working on the 100 small and large things that a working ranch required, and that a woman running it alone with 2 children and no hired hand could not keep up with. He replaced the roof of the barn section by section. He rebuilt the north fence that had been falling since the previous fall. He helped Sam learn to properly halter and lead a horse, because Sam was old enough and eager and deserved to be taught. He sat on the porch in the evenings sometimes and drank coffee and talked with Georgia about the case and about everything else, and it was the talking about everything else that was the problem. She was the most interesting person he had encountered in a long time. She read everything she could get. She had a small collection of books that she had brought from Atlanta and had added to whenever she was in Abilene, and she had opinions about all of them, and she expected you to have opinions too and would argue yours until you either convinced her or she convinced you. She knew more about water rights law than her lawyer. She knew more about the migratory patterns of the cattle she raised than most men who had been in the business twice as long as she had. She was patient with her children in the mornings and honest with them about hard things, and she didn't pretend that the situation was easier than it was. But she also didn't let it swallow the ordinary good things, the good biscuits, the wildflowers that Nora collected and put in a jar on the windowsill, the particular quality of light on the hills in the late afternoon. He tried very hard to keep his feelings to one side. He failed at this gradually, and then all at once, the way you fail at most things you are trying not to do. It happened on a Wednesday evening in late April. The weather had turned one of those sudden swings that West Texas specialized in, a north wind coming down with a cold front that had no right to appear in late April, but appeared anyway. Georgia had been out in the kitchen garden when it hit, and she came inside with her hair half down and her jacket not enough, shivering and laughing slightly at having been caught out. And Edgar, who had been helping Sam with an arithmetic problem at the table, looked up and felt something in his chest rearrange itself with a completeness that was both terrifying and absolutely final. He looked back down at Sam's arithmetic problem and very carefully did not say or do anything that would make the situation complicated. But Georgia looked at him over Sam's head, and there was something in her face, something that was questioning and a little startled, that made him think she might not be entirely unaware of things herself. Neither of them said a word about it that evening. The legal case moved forward in fits and starts through May and into June, the way these things did. Darrow's lawyers filed a response to the Harper claim that was, as Whitfield wrote to Georgia, prolix and deliberate in its obfuscation. meaning they had written a great deal of dense legal language designed to slow things down and make the whole matter expensive. Darrow clearly expected that Georgia would run out of money or patience before the case was resolved. He did not know Georgia Harper. She wrote back to Whitfield with detailed directions on each of the counterclaims, having read the filing herself, and annotated it with a clarity that made Whitfield's response letter sound, for the first time, slightly impressed. Edgar helped by providing a detailed written statement about the construction of the diversion channels, the dates, the measurements, and the conversation he had witnessed between Thomas Harper and Cornelius Darrow. He also remembered, and this turned out to be important, the name of the county surveyor who had been present when the channels were staked out, a man named Fletcher who still worked for the county, and who, when Whitfield's letters reached him, turned out to have kept his own field notes from that survey. Fletcher's notes, which Whitfield subpoenaed in early June, showed clearly that the diversion channels had been constructed to alter the natural flow of the Callow Creek, and that the survey had been conducted 5 months after Thomas Harper's water rights filing had been officially recorded. It was, Whitfield wrote to Georgia, an extremely strong position. It was also, as everyone in Harlan County seemed to know by now, a position that Cornelius Darrow was not going to accept quietly. The news of the case had spread through the county the way news always spread in small communities, through the general store and the church steps and the Saturday market, and the long network of conversations that ran between neighboring farms and ranches. Opinions were divided, though not evenly. Most of the smaller operators, the farmers and small ranchers who worked the eastern and southern parts of the county, were quietly, carefully supportive of Georgia. Most of them had their own frustrations with the Darrow operation's tendency to expand in ways that were aggressive and sometimes of dubious legality, and they watched what was happening with the cautious hope of people who have been bullied for a long time and are watching someone else push back. Darrow's supporters were louder and fewer, but they included Burl Cates and most of the Darrow Cowboys and the county commissioner, a man named Wills who had been Darrow's man for a decade, and they made their support known in ways designed to be uncomfortable. The ride-alongs on the fence line, the pointed looks in town, the occasional dropped comment in the general store about how it was a shame what happened to people who made trouble they couldn't handle. Georgia heard these things and kept going. Edgar heard them too, and what he felt was a kind of cold, focused anger that was entirely different from the hot, useless kind. It made him very calm and very clear. On a Friday morning in late June, he was at the Harper place mending the south pasture fence when he heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Burl Cates riding toward him on the county road. Burl pulled up and leaned on his saddle horn and looked down at Edgar with an expression of deliberate ease. "You're a long way from your usual line of work, Maddox," Burl said. "I go where the work is," Edgar said. "That's a charitable way to put it." Burl looked at the house. "Must be nice making yourself comfortable on a widow's property." Edgar straightened up from the fence post and looked at Burl for a moment. "You want to say something, Burl, say it plain." "Mister. Darrow's saying the woman should take what's fair and walk away before this gets drawn out and expensive, and she loses what she started with." Burl delivered this with the smooth authority of someone who has been paid to deliver messages, but with an undercurrent of personal satisfaction that was impossible to miss. "She's not interested in walking away," Edgar said. "That's what Mr. Darrow figured," Burl said. "Figured you'd tell her that too, since you're apparently her man now." He emphasized the last two words with a faint smile. "I'm not her man," Edgar said, which was both true and felt like a lie, and he hated the feeling. "Could have fooled me." Burl gathered his reins. "Think hard on this, Ed. Darrow's got a long reach. A man who burns his bridges the way you have better make sure the other side is worth swimming to." He rode off, and Edgar watched him go and then turned back to the fence post and drove the next staple with more force than was strictly necessary. Georgia appeared at the corner of the barn. She had been close enough to hear, and she was watching the dust of Burl Cates' departure with flat, controlled eyes. "He's delivering messages now," she said. "Yes." They're worried. She looked at Edgar. If they weren't worried, they wouldn't bother with messages. That's one way to look at it. She came and stood beside him, looking at the south pasture where her cattle were grazing in the thin summer grass. The Callow Creek channel ran dry along the eastern edge, just a pale line in the earth where water had once moved freely. "I want you to know," she said, without looking at him, "that whatever happens with this case, whatever happens, I'm grateful for what you've done. I'm grateful that you walked into that courthouse." "It was the right thing to do," he said. "That's not why I'm grateful. I'm grateful because it cost you something real and you did it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "Mrs. Harper, Georgia, there's something I want to say to you, and I want to say it now because I don't want there to be any confusion about my reasons for being here." She turned and looked at him directly. "I came to the courthouse because it was right," he said. "And I've come here every morning because the work needed doing and because I believed in what you were fighting for. Those things are true and they're separate." He held her gaze. "But they're not the only reason anymore, and I think you deserve to know that." She was very still. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know what you're carrying, and I know this is not the time or the circumstances for anything beyond what we have. I didn't want to stand here and pretend that I was indifferent because I'm not, and pretending otherwise felt like a kind of dishonesty." Georgia was quiet for what felt like a long time. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the south pasture, 3 clear notes in the summer heat. "I appreciate you saying it plainly," she said at last. Her voice was careful but not cold. "Thomas has been gone less than a year. I know. And I'm in the middle of the hardest fight I've ever been in." "I know that too." She looked at the dry creek bed. "I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed," she said, so quietly that he almost missed it. He didn't say anything. He understood that there was nothing to say in answer to that, and that saying nothing was the correct and respectful thing. She looked back at him with those changing eyes and said, "Give me time." "As long as you need," he said. She nodded once and went back to the house, and Edgar went back to the fence post, and both of them felt in their separate and carefully maintained ways something shift that could not be unshifted. The formal hearing on the water rights claim was scheduled for the second week of July, before the county land commissioner. A different commissioner than the one in Darrow's pocket, since Whitfield had arranged for the matter to be heard at the district level rather than the county level, citing a conflict of interest that was hard to argue with given Commissioner Will's well-known relationship with Darrow. The hearing was held in the district court building in Harlan County, a 2-day ride east. Georgia went with Whitfield, and Edgar went with them to serve as the principal witness. Sam and Nora stayed with Mrs. Alderman, Sam under strict instructions to check the cattle morning and evening and report anything unusual. The hearing room was close and warm in the July heat, with tall windows that let in the sun but not much air, and a long table where the district land commissioner, a methodical man named Holt who had a reputation for fairness and a complete lack of patience for theatrics, presided over the proceedings. Darrow's lawyers were 2 men from San Antonio, polished and expensive and practiced in the particular art of filling a room with language designed to confuse rather than clarify. They began by challenging the original Harper water rights filing on a technicality of recording procedure, arguing that a minor error in the filing date notation, a transcription error made by the county clerk, not by Thomas Harper, invalidated the claim. It was the kind of argument that was designed to make the whole case hinge on a procedural point rather than the underlying facts, and Whitfield had anticipated it and was prepared. Edgar testified on the second morning of the hearing. He was direct and specific, describing the construction of the diversion channels in the kind of detail that can only come from someone who had done the physical work, the specific placement, the dates, the conversations with the foreman, what he had been told, and what he had figured out for himself later. He was not dramatic about it. He answered the questions and corrected the record when Darrow's lawyers tried to mischaracterize what he had said, calmly and precisely, and did not lose his composure when they challenged his motivations, or suggested his testimony was colored by personal interest. Commissioner Holt listened to all of it behind his expressionless face and his neat pile of documents and took copious notes. Georgia testified last, before the closing arguments. She had never testified in a legal proceeding before, and she had told Edgar the night before the hearing, over dinner at the boarding house where they were all staying, that she was aware of it and intended to proceed anyway. She presented her evidence: the original water rights filing, the correspondence with the land commissioner's office, the surveyor's notes, her own careful records of the creek's flow decline over the 3 years since the diversion channels were built, with a precision and clarity that made the room very quiet. When one of Darrow's lawyers attempted to suggest that her records were unreliable because she was not a trained surveyor or engineer, she looked at him calmly and said, "My husband and I built this ranch from bare land, Mr. Donahue. I have measured and recorded every gallon of water that has passed through our property since we arrived, because water is life in this country, and I learned very quickly that no one else was going to keep track of it for us." There was a small, barely audible sound from the few observers in the back of the room that was as close to applause as people generally got in a legal proceeding. Commissioner Holt delivered his decision 8 days later by written order, which Whitfield brought to Georgia at the Harper place on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Edgar was there, having spent the morning helping Sam with the cattle, and he watched Georgia read the order standing at the kitchen table with the same steady composure she maintained about most things, and then he watched that composure crack very slightly when she looked up. "He found in our favor," she said. Her voice was almost steady. "Complete restoration of the original water rights filing. Darrow is ordered to remove the secondary diversion channel within 60 days and restore the natural flow of the creek." Whitfield, who was nearly vibrating with professional satisfaction, confirmed that the order was binding and immediate, and that the penalty for noncompliance was significant. He also noted, with some pleasure, that it included a formal reprimand of Commissioner Wills for the conflict of interest, and a requirement for the county to review any other decisions in which Darrow's influence over the commission could be demonstrated. Sam let out a whoop from the doorway, where he had been listening, and Nora, not entirely sure what had happened, but understanding from her brother's response that it was very good, immediately started jumping up and down. Georgia put the order down on the table and pressed both hands flat on it, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked up at Edgar, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely accounted for by the legal victory. "We won," she said. "You won," he said, because it was true. She laughed that real, clear laugh, and it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. The 60-day order was complied with, not because Cornelius Darrow had any great desire to comply, but because his lawyers told him, clearly and firmly, that the alternative consequences were worse. In late September, a crew appeared on the north stretch of Callow Creek and began dismantling the secondary channel, and within 3 weeks the work was done, and the creek ran free again, not roaring, because it was a modest creek in a dry country, but steady and clear, and following its original path down through the limestone hills and onto the Harper property. Georgia stood on the east bank of her property and watched the water run in its restored channel, and Edgar stood beside her, and Sam and Nora were at the water's edge throwing stones, and it was a Tuesday morning in early October with the first real cool of autumn in the air, and the hills going gold and rust on the north side. "My father used to say," Georgia said, watching the water, "that a woman who knows what she wants and isn't afraid to say it will always find her way eventually." "He was right," Edgar said. She glanced at him sideways. "He also said that knowing what you want is the hardest part." Edgar looked at the running water. He had been patient for 4 months, and patience was something he was genuinely good at, but it had been the most difficult 4 months of patient waiting he had undertaken since he was a man. "Do you know what you want?" he asked carefully. She was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. "Yes," she said. "I've known for a while." She turned and looked at him fully, and her voice was steady and clear. "I've been letting myself get used to the idea." He turned to look at her. "You are," she said, "the most decent man I have encountered in a very long time, Edgar Maddox, and I have been trying not to want things I wasn't sure I had the right to want yet." "You have every right," he said. "Thomas has been gone 14 months, she said. It wasn't an accusation or an apology. It was just a fact she was naming, acknowledging it plainly the way she acknowledged most things. "I know," he said, "and I'm not asking you to stop grieving him. He was a good man by everything you've told me, and he built something real, and losing him was a real loss. I wouldn't ask you to pretend otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment with those changing eyes, and then she said, "I'm not pretending anything." He reached out and took her hand very carefully, the way you take something that matters to you, and she let him. And they stood on the bank of the restored Callow Creek, while the October sun moved overhead and Sam and Nora threw stones and the water ran over limestone, and the whole long difficult year began to feel, finally, like something it was possible to come through on the other side of. He asked her properly that winter in December, on the porch in the cold with the stars impossibly bright, and the plains stretching out in every direction in the dark, clear Texas night. He asked without any flourishes or prepared speeches, because he was not that kind of man, and she would not have wanted those things from him. He asked plainly, which was the right way to ask Georgia Harper anything. She said yes the same way, plainly, and without hesitation, which told him that she had been sure for longer than she was admitting. They were married in February of 1885 in the Harlan County church, which was a modest building of whitewashed board and not much else, but which was full on the day of the wedding in the way that small churches in small communities fill up for events that carry weight, not just as celebrations but as statements. The people of the smaller farms and ranches of Harlan County came in numbers that surprised both Georgia and Edgar, and what their presence said was something the community had not had occasion to say very loudly before, that they saw what had happened, and they were glad it had ended this way. Sam was 10 by then, old enough to understand most of it, and he stood next to his mother at the ceremony with the serious dignity of a boy who had been carrying more responsibility than his years warranted, and was learning to trust that it was not all on his shoulders anymore. Nora was 7 and wore her best dress and had wildflowers in her hair, because she had discovered that Edgar would indulge her in this sort of thing, and she had acted accordingly. Mrs. Alderman sat in the front pew and cried in a brisk, unsentimental way that was somehow both surprising and entirely in character. Whitfield, who had ridden out from Abilene for the occasion, shook Edgar's hand afterward with more warmth than Edgar had expected from him, and told Georgia that it had been the most satisfying case of his career, which Georgia thanked him for, and which she privately suspected was true. Cornelius Darrow did not attend the wedding, but nobody had expected him to. He had retreated from the fight without making any public statement about it, which was perhaps the most Cornelius Darrow response possible, to simply absorb the loss and go back to managing his empire, which was still the largest in the county, regardless of this particular setback. The legal reprimand of Commissioner Wills had resulted in Wills losing his re-election bid that fall, which had been an additional loss for Darrow's political influence in the county, and Edgar suspected that Darrow was recalibrating rather than simply giving up. But the water rights order was permanent and binding, and the creek ran free on the Harper land on the Maddox Harper land, or however they would eventually settle the naming of it, and that was what mattered most. Edgar had found work with a neighboring ranch, the Kellner operation, which ran about 4,000 acres south of the county seat, and was run by a man named Joseph Kellner who had no fondness for Darrow and had been actively looking for a good foreman since the previous spring. Edgar rode for Kellner 5 days a week and spent the rest of his time on the Harper place, which he and Georgia had decided to run jointly Georgia's cattle operation, and the water rights claim that was now fully restored and fully documented, and the additional land improvements that became possible once the water was reliable again. The kitchen garden expanded. The barn was finished, truly finished, with a proper roof and a sound floor and enough stalls to accommodate the additional animals they were planning to bring in. Sam developed, over that first spring and summer of the new arrangement, a relationship with Edgar that was not the uncomplicated ease of a child with a blood parent but was its own genuine thing, a kind of earned trust between two people who were both careful and who both had enough sense to appreciate steadiness when they found it. Nora attached herself to Edgar with the decisive enthusiasm that 7-year-olds are capable of when they decide they like someone, and Edgar responded to this with a slightly bemused affection that Georgia found entirely charming to watch. The spring of 1885 was a good one, more rain than they'd had in several years, the grass coming in green and thick, the creek running at its highest level in Georgia's memory. They added 15 head to the cattle operation, which was possible now that the water supply was reliable enough to support a larger herd. Edgar's knowledge of cattle management, 4 years of working one of the largest operations in the county, had taught him a great deal. Whatever else the Darrow experience had cost him complemented Georgia's understanding of the land and the water, and together they made decisions that were better than either of them would have made alone. In the late summer of that year, Georgia told Edgar she was pregnant. He was in the barn when she found him, brushing down his gelding after a long day at the Kellner operation. She came in from the evening light and leaned against the stall door and looked at him with a complicated expression that was partly nervous and partly simply radiant, and he put down the brush before she had finished the sentence. He crossed the barn in 3 strides and gathered her carefully and completely, with his arms around her and his face pressed into her hair, and he stayed there for a long time without saying anything because words seemed inadequate to the fullness of what he felt. "Say something," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "I am," he said. "I'm just saying it quietly." She laughed, and he felt the laugh against his chest, and he thought that he had not known, coming into this year, how much he had been capable of wanting something until he had something specific to want. Their son was born in April of 1886, strong and loud, and with his mother's auburn hair and his father's gray eyes in an improbable combination that made Mrs. Alderman, who was present at the delivery, declare him the finest-looking infant she had seen in 30 years of Harlan County births. They named him Thomas Edgar Maddox, Thomas for the man who had built this land and fought for it, and deserved to be remembered, Edgar for the man who was here now, which was its own kind of honor. Sam, who was 11 by then and had gone through the pregnancy with the slightly solemn awareness of a child who understands that a new sibling is a real change and not a small one, held the baby with great care on the first morning and then looked up at his mother and said, "He's very small." "He'll grow," Georgia said. Sam was small too, Edgar added, from the corner of the room where he was trying to stay out of the way and not entirely succeeding. Sam gave Edgar a measuring look and then looked back at the baby. "All right," he said, with the tone of a boy who had considered the situation and found it acceptable, which was, in its way, everything. Nora's response was immediate and uncomplicated. She declared the baby perfect and immediately began planning what she was going to teach him, which at the moment included how to find the best wildflowers in the East Meadow and how to make a whistle out of a piece of dry grass. Edgar listened to this planning with a straight face that cost him some effort. The summer of 1886 was the year that the smaller ranchers and farmers of Harlan County began, quietly and gradually, to push back in other ways against the dominance of the Darrow operation, not through legal action, but through the organization of a county farmers' association that pooled resources for things like shared water testing and collective purchasing of seed and basic equipment. It had been forming in fragments for years, But the Harper water rights case had given people a clearer sense of what was possible when someone stood up and made the legal case correctly. And the association formalized itself in July with a charter meeting at the county seat. Georgia was one of the founding members. She sat at the planning table with the same deliberate, methodical intelligence she brought to everything. And she brought Edgar with her. And Edgar brought the practical knowledge of large-scale ranching operations that most of the small farmers in the room had never had access to. What he knew about how the Darrow operation managed its water and its land, where its efficiencies were, and where it was vulnerable to the kind of collective pressure that an organized county association could bring to bear, was information that was genuinely useful and freely given. Cornelius Darrow was not invited to the association meeting, and he did not attend, and the meeting took place anyway, which was in itself a kind of statement. By the fall of 1886, the Harper Maddox Ranch, they had settled on the hyphenated name because Georgia had built it and Edgar was building it alongside her, and both things were true, had expanded by another quarter section through the legal purchase of land that had become available to the east. The new land had its own water access, a secondary spring that fed into the Callow Creek system, and Edgar spent the better part of the autumn developing that spring into a reliable watering point for the additional cattle they were now running. The work was long and physical and constant, the way ranch work was, and there were days when the exhaustion was profound and the problems piled up faster than the solutions. But there was nothing in that kind of tiredness that felt like hopelessness, because it was the tiredness of building something real. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Georgia and Edgar sat on the porch and watched the stars over the Texas plain. The vast, luminous abundance of them that you could only see in country this flat and this empty, and talked or didn't talk. And the silence between them was the particular silence of two people who are genuinely comfortable with each other, which is rarer and more valuable than it sounds. She told him once, on a warm night in the late autumn, that she had thought about leaving Texas after Thomas died. That she had thought about going back to Georgia, to her family, to the places and people she had known before the West had made its claims on her. "What made you stay?" he asked. "Sam and Nora," she said. "The cattle, the land." She was quiet for a moment. "The creek. The creek. Thomas had fought for that creek," she said. "I wasn't going to walk away from what he'd fought for just because he was gone. That felt like losing twice." She looked at the stars. "And then, I don't know. The more I fought for it, the more I understood why he'd wanted it so much. Not just the water, but the having of something that's yours, that you built and that nobody can simply take because they're bigger than you." She glanced at him. "That might sound stubborn." "It sounds like you," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then she leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings in a way that was easy and familiar and that he never quite got over. "I'm glad you walked into that courthouse," she said. "I'm glad you were there when I did," he said. It was as close as either of them usually got to the kind of declaration that appeared in novels, and it was, for both of them, exactly enough. The following spring brought a second addition to the Harper Maddox operation in the form of a young cowboy named Pete Reyes, a 22-year-old from a Mexican-American family who had been working a seasonal position at the Kellner operation, and who had a gift with horses that Edgar had noticed immediately. Edgar and Georgia offered him a permanent position, and he accepted it, and he turned out to be one of the best decisions they made that year. He was quiet and reliable, and had an ease with the horses and the cattle that added a steadiness to the operation, and he and Sam formed, over the course of that summer, the kind of unlikely friendship that develops between people who share work and a certain serious-minded humor about the world. Georgia had hired a Mexican-American hand without hesitation in a county where that was sometimes remarked upon, and when it was remarked upon she said, plainly, that she hired based on competence and character, and that she had noticed a correlation between the people who complained about her hiring choices and the people who had found Cornelius Darrow's way of doing things acceptable, and she left others to draw their own conclusions from that correlation. The remark spread through the county in the way remarks do, and most people who heard it thought the better of her for it. In 1887, the county held a new election for land commissioner. The candidate who ran with the explicit support of the Farmers Association was a man named Orville Prescott, who had spent 20 years as a working rancher and had his own history of difficulties with the Darrow operation's expansionist practices. Cornelius Darrow put his own candidate forward, a man named Calhoun who was polished and well-spoken and had Darrow's money behind him. Prescott won by 11 votes. It was not a revolution. The Darrow Ranch was still the largest operation in the county and would remain so for years. Cornelius Darrow was not the kind of man who simply disappeared because he lost a legal case and an election. But there was something different about Harlan County in the years following the water rights case. A different sense of what was possible for the smaller operators. A different sense of whether the law could actually be used for the purposes it claimed to serve. A different sense of what it meant when ordinary people organized themselves around shared interests, rather than simply accepting that power arranged itself in one direction only. Georgia understood that she was not entirely responsible for this shift, and she was not given to inflating her own importance. But she also understood, without undue modesty, that the case had mattered beyond her own property line, and that mattering was worth something. Thomas Edgar Maddox, Little Thomas, who became Tom almost immediately in the family's day-to-day life, was walking by the time of the election, a determined and perpetually dirty child who had inherited his mother's methodical nature and his father's calm stubbornness in an alarming combination. He followed Edgar around the property with a seriousness of purpose that made grown men smile and made Edgar's chest ache in the particular way that parental love ached, which was something he had not known about before and now could not imagine having been without. Nora, now 8, had progressed from planning to teach Tom about wildflowers and grass whistles to actually teaching him, with mixed results, and had also decided she wanted to learn to read maps. Edgar taught her this over the course of several evenings at the kitchen table, and she took to it with an avidity that suggested she had been looking for exactly this kind of precision her whole life. Sam, at 12, was doing the work of a full ranch hand and doing it well, and Edgar had begun teaching him the financial side of the operation. How to account for expenses and project for seasons, how to read the markets for cattle prices, how to plan ahead in a business where the land and the weather and the world were always capable of surprise. Georgia watched all of this, her family, her rebuilt and growing operation, the county that was slowly changing, and felt something she could only name as fullness. Not the absence of difficulty, because there was always difficulty, and the land was hard and the weather was unpredictable, and there was always something breaking down or going wrong or requiring more than you had. But a fullness that had to do with knowing that what you were doing was real, and that the people beside you were real, and that all of it had been fought for and chosen with open eyes. She was expecting their second child by the spring of 1888. Edgar found out the way he always seemed to find out about important things with Georgia. She told him directly, in the middle of an ordinary moment, the day's last light coming through the kitchen window, Tom on her hip, and the smell of supper on the stove. She said it plain and he heard it plain, and the look that passed between them in that kitchen was the look of two people who had built something together from hard ground and were standing in the middle of it and knew exactly what they had. Their daughter was born that autumn in October on a day with a blue sky and the first cold edge of fall on the air, and they named her Clara Jane Maddox Jane for Georgia's mother. Clara because Georgia had always liked it, and because it had a clear, simple sound that fit the child from the first moment. Sam, now 13 and practically a young man, held his half-sister with the careful gravity he had brought to all important things, and declared her excellent. Tom, who was 2.5 and not entirely sure about the situation, eventually decided He approved of Clara on the grounds that she was interested in watching him do things, which was all he had really needed. Nora was 9 and immediately in love with the baby and the wholehearted, declaring way that 9-year-old girls are in love with babies, and spent the first weeks volunteering for every task associated with Clara's care that was within the capacity of a 9-year-old to perform, which was considerably more than most adults expected. The winter of 1888 into 1889 was the first winter in Georgia's memory that felt genuinely peaceful. Not because nothing was difficult, because plenty of things were, but because the difficulties were the ordinary ones of a working ranch and a growing family, and not the grinding, desperate kind that had defined the previous years. There were cattle to manage and equipment to repair, and Sam's ongoing education to think about. Georgia had been corresponding with a school in Abilene that was taking on older students who had done their early education in scattered frontier circumstances, and Sam had expressed interest in possibly going there when he was 14. Edgar supported this without hesitation, which Georgia had expected. Sam had asked him quietly one evening whether Edgar thought he should go, and Edgar had said that a man who had the chance for education and passed it up out of false modesty or misplaced practicality was a man who was already deciding his own limits for him, which was exactly what certain powerful people had been counting on for generations, and that Sam was going to Abilene if Sam wanted to go to Abilene. Sam went to Abilene the following September. He was not gone forever. He came home for the school breaks, and he wrote letters that were increasingly well-organized and thoughtful. And the summer of 1890 he came home and rode the fence lines and worked the cattle with the same competence he had always had, but with an additional layer of understanding that showed in how he talked about things. He was interested in law. Not in the fussy procedural way of some lawyers, but in the same way Georgia had always been interested in it, as a tool for making the world behave closer to the way it was supposed to behave, which required knowing how the tool worked. Georgia was not surprised. She had raised him to understand that fighting for what was right required as much knowledge as it required courage, and Sam Harper had paid attention to both her words and her example. The Harper Maddox Ranch had grown by 1890 into a genuine mid-size operation, not the enormous scale of Darrow's empire, but something real and independently sound, with 120 head of cattle, reliable water, good grass, and a reputation in the county for fair dealing. Georgia had twice been asked to speak to the Farmers Association about water rights and land management, and had done so in her direct, methodical way that people found both accessible and genuinely useful. Pete Reyes had brought his younger brother onto the operation by then, a man of 20 who was learning everything Pete had learned, and had additionally proved to be the best natural hand with the cattle on the property, with a particular gift for reading the herd's behavior and anticipating problems before they became crises. Cornelius Darrow died in 1891 of heart failure in his 2-story limestone house with the glass windows that had been freighted from San Antonio. He left his ranch to his eldest son, a man named Fletcher Darrow, who was, by most accounts, significantly less aggressive than his father, not from any particular moral improvement, but from a temperamental difference that made him more interested in managing what he had than in expanding it. The relationship between the Darrow Ranch and the surrounding community did not immediately become warm, but it became less actively combative, which was something. Burl Cates retired to a place in New Mexico Territory. Nobody at the Harper Maddox Ranch was sorry to see him go. In the spring of 1892, Sam came home for good. He had finished his studies and had passed the Texas bar examination, which made him one of the younger attorneys in the district, and he had decided to set up practice in Harlan County, which needed legal representation that was not already in someone's pocket. He rented an office above the hardware store in town and hung out a sign and went to work. He was 22 years old and already had, in the view of most of Harlan County, more common sense than most lawyers twice his age. Nora, 17 and growing increasingly restless on the ranch in the particular way of a person who has outgrown their immediate circumstances and needs something larger, had been corresponding with a women's college in Missouri. Georgia had read the letters carefully and then told Nora that if she was serious, she should apply formally, and that they would find a way to manage the cost. Nora applied. She was accepted by summer. Tom, who was 6, was already inseparable from the horses in a way that predicted a straightforward future in ranching. And Clara, who was 4, was already doing what all the youngest children of determined women do, watching everything carefully and saving her conclusions for the right moment. Edgar watched his family on a Saturday evening in the autumn of 1892, from the porch of the house that had been extended twice over the years to accommodate the growth of everything, and felt the weight of the years in the best possible way, not as burden but as substance, the way good things accumulate. Georgia came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee, the way she had done hundreds of times in the years between that first evening when he had appeared at her door after losing his job, and they sat in the cooling autumn air and watched the light change on the limestone hills to the north. "Sam has a client," she said. "All ready? Mrs. Alderman's nephew. A property dispute." Edgar smiled. "Mrs. Alderman will expect a discount." "Sam will give her one," Georgia said. "He has better sense than to argue with Mrs. Alderman." The hills were going deep gold and rust in the last of the day's light, and the creek, their creek, the Callow Creek that ran free and clear along the eastern edge of the property, was catching that light in a way that made it look almost like it was made of something more valuable than water. "I've been thinking," Georgia said. "That's always the beginning of something interesting," Edgar said. She smiled, which was still the thing that made the whole arrangement of the world seem correct to him. "I've been thinking about the North Pasture," she said. "If we develop the spring up there properly, we could run another 20 head on that land." "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw you looking at it. How long have you known?" "About a week." She sipped her coffee. "I was waiting to see if you'd say it. And if I hadn't," she looked at him with those creek-colored eyes, "then I'd have said it myself, which is what I just did." He laughed, which was something he did more in the company of this woman than he had done in any previous decade of his life, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went out into the cooling Texas evening, and the wide sky absorbed it easily, the way the sky in that country absorbed everything, the heat and the drought and the difficult years and the good ones, impartially and without sentiment. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it the way she had learned to lean into things that were real and solid and worth trusting, and they sat on the porch of their extended, slightly ramshackle, utterly functional house, and watched the night come in from the east, and the stars appear one by one over the limestone hills, and the creek ran silver in the last of the light, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The county of Harlan, Texas, would go on changing slowly, unevenly, with forward steps and backward ones, the way all places change. The small farmers and ranchers would continue organizing, with varying success. The law would continue to be a tool that worked better for some than for others, though slightly less extremely than it had before a widow named Georgia Harper had filed a water rights claim, and a cowboy named Edgar Maddox had walked out of the biggest ranch in the county and said she was right. Sam Harper would go on to practice law in Harlan County for 40 years, becoming one of its most respected citizens, and would be known in particular for the work he did on behalf of smaller landowners facing exactly the kind of pressures his mother had faced, armed with exactly the kind of methodical evidence gathering she had modeled. He would marry a schoolteacher named Rosa in 1896, and they would have 4 children, and the oldest of them, a daughter, against the usual order of things, would have her grandmother's eyes. Nora Maddox would complete her studies in Missouri and would return to Texas, but not to Harlan County. She would settle in Austin, where she would work as a teacher, and eventually as one of the first women to advocate formally for women's educational rights in the state, which was the kind of work that suited her methodical, passionate nature exactly. She would visit the ranch every Christmas until she could not, and she would bring flowers every time. Tom Maddox would grow into the rancher his early love of horses promised, and would eventually take over the day-to-day management of the Harper Maddox operation as Edgar got older, with the same steady, patient competence his father had modeled, and with a talent for reading weather and water that his mother had taught him. Clara Maddox would turn out to be the most academically gifted of the 4 children, which surprised no one who had watched her careful childhood habit of observation, and would follow her brother Sam into law, a harder path for a woman. But she had been raised by Georgia Harper, and difficulty of that kind was not something the Harper Maddox women found discouraging. Georgia herself would live to see the turn of the century, and past it, on the land she had fought for, the creek running free, the cattle grazing in good years and enduring in bad ones, the house full of grandchildren on Christmas and quiet the rest of the time in the productive, contented way of a house where good work has been done. She would stand at the kitchen window in the mornings and watch Edgar crossing the yard toward the barn with the slightly slower walk of a man in his 50s who has used his body hard for 30 years and is not complaining about it. And she would feel each morning that same clarifying fullness, the knowledge that what she had is real, and that she chose it, and that it chose her back. He would look up from the yard and see her in the window, the way he had been looking up and finding her for 20 years, and he would raise his hand slightly in greeting, the small and specific greeting of 2 people who have said everything important to each other so many times, and in so many ways that the small gestures carry all of it. And the creek would run on between the limestone banks, through the Harper Maddox land, clear and steady in the good seasons and thin but present in the dry ones, following the course that had been filed for and fought for and restored, because one woman had refused to accept that the biggest ranch in the county had the right to simply take what belonged to her, and because one man had stepped out of that ranch and said she was right. Water is life in the Texas Hill Country. And some things once fought for stay won.